This is witty witty, a weed that grows well in dry areas in Antiguan Barbuda. Witty witty it doesn't look like much, does it? But it got people through starvation and famine. Witty witty is the original ingredient in pepper pot, the national dish. And pepper pot is a thick green stew. It's nutritious, it's a little bit slimy, but delicious. Although I haven't tried the original witty witty variety, because today pepper pot is made with a range of crop ingredients. Spinach, eggplant, okra, edo leaves, spices, and altogether these ingredients require 2,500 gallons of water, from start in the field to finish on your stove. That's about 3 of these 800-gallon tanks, which we recognize. They're at the back of most people's homes. That's a lot of water for one pot of pepper pot. And what this example shows is that we have a culture of innovation because we took a weed and we turned it into a pot of delicious food. The second thing that it shows is that our tastes and our preferences have evolved over time and changed, so that we require more resources now than ever before. We require more land, more water, and more energy. But we're confined to an island of 108 square miles, so our resources are very limited. We need to take that culture of innovation and turn it towards the environment, especially our freshwater resources, here's how my grandparents dealt with water scarcity. In 1956, they sailed into the south coast of Antigua. Lisa from the US and Desmond from Ireland met on the boat and fell in love. There wasn't much infrastructure then at that time, and so when they were looking for a house, they climbed up one of those hills in the background, found an old catchment built by the British. They patched that up, put up their roof and walls, and started collecting water that way. And that was the only water source that they had, and it remained the only water source for my family to this day, this cistern. And it worked out for the most part, except when I was 6 years old and we ran out of water. And my parents decided to teach us a lesson about being more careful with our water resources. And so instead of getting a truckload of water to come and refill the tank, they decided we would stay run out of water for a week. And every day, we would take our buckets of water and walk down the hill to the village standpipe, fill up the buckets, and then walk back up the hill. It was a pretty tough lesson, struggling around with that at that age. But it was effective, and it informed my personal and professional choices going forward. So it was so effective, I went on to do environmental studies. I did a bachelor's in international environmental policy. A few years later, a master's in environmental management, where I started studying climate change and how it impacts islands especially. And at Yale, where I did my master's, there's a tradition of decorating your cap. And on top of my cap was a sea level rise scenario using the Antigua black pineapple as islands and the ocean. And so I went away to study climate change and the unique impacts and threats that it poses to small islands. Things that probably sound familiar to you: sea level rise, intensifying hurricanes, increasing temperatures, acidifying oceans, and changing rainfall patterns, leading to more flooding and more drought. These are scary things, but the resounding message that came out of these studies is that what we do on the ground changes how these things affect us. That's why I came back to work with the Environment Division in the government here. So let me show you first what's at risk. This is Julian. He lives in the outskirts of St. John's, the capital. And Julian's dealing with flooding and erosion in his yard. He used to have a small, harmless stream running through it. But in recent times, that's been getting bigger and bigger because of more flooding. And when the water pours over the road and hits the ground. It washes the soil downstream. And so every year, he watches more soil go, and that bank of that river get closer and closer to the foundations of his home. When I was asking Julian when all of this started, he said he didn't used to have flooding problems and erosion 20, 30 years ago, which I was very surprised about. So what has changed between then and now to cause this problem? The first thing we might look at is rainfall, since we're talking about climate change. So here's a rainfall graph for the last 35 years. It's standardized so that the green bars show when we got more rainfall than average. The red bars show when we got less rainfall. And then overall, the bigger picture shows that even without any statistical analysis, you can clearly see we're definitely not getting more rainfall today than we were in the past. So that can't explain Julian's flooding problems alone. In fact, this trend is consistent with projections for the island, which say we could get half as much rain by the end of the century as we are today. So those drought periods are more common. But getting back to our original question of why is Julian experiencing this flooding? It's not only because of the rain. This is only part of the story. So let's take a look at what has changed on the ground during the same time period. In the northwest coast of Antigua is McKinnon's Pond. And we're going to go back in time to 1966. The left-hand side, the black and white photo, shows that there's mostly open agricultural fields. You can't really find many buildings in there. Contrast that to the right-hand side, where there's a lot of buildings. We now have residential development, tourism infrastructure, shopping malls, and road network. So 2 trends to point out in this comparison. The first one is backfilling wetlands. Take a look at the area inside that red line. That's where the stream empties out St. John's watershed into McKinnon's Pond. In 1966, that was open mangrove wetlands. By 2010, that is now backfilled residential development. Not surprisingly, they are at the highest risk of flooding in the area. And so what happens is when wetlands, which are naturally the lowest point on land, when we get those torrential downpours, the water floods there until it can drain out at a slower pace. So we backfill it, we change the elevation, and we've now made the lowest point on land somewhere else, maybe upstream, downstream, or by the side. And we've created flooding problems where there weren't any before. The second trend is impervious cover, concrete. We love driving cars. Who likes driving cars here? And cars require a nice parking space at A and a nice parking space at B. Well, concrete means that it's impervious surface. So when we get that rain, it doesn't get absorbed into the land. Instead, it runs off in greater volumes and at a faster pace, making it more likely to erode. And so we've figured out 2 of probably other factors that are causing this flooding at Julian's Culvert. So now, when we look back at his problem, we can understand that it's because of what's happening upstream on the ground in the watershed that's causing this. And Julian has a nice house. He has a job. Him and his wife are raising a middle-income family. But they can't afford to build that wall to protect their house. And in the worst-case scenario, do they have insurance? So we start to see how environmental problems, if we don't address them, cause social impacts. But these impacts aren't felt equally across the board. Take a look at these 2 houses. The one on the left is a small wooden home. A single mother lives there with her 3 kids. She can't afford to pay electricity, which is the highest price among the highest price in the world here, and 3 times higher than in the US. So no electricity. And under that house, you can just make out reflection of light on a puddle. That was there when I visited during the dry season, so it's there year-round. and it breeds mosquitoes, which carry chikungunya and dengue viruses. And so there's health impacts as well. Contrast that to the right-hand side, a home that's concrete, 2 stories high, where the family lives in the 2nd story. Both of these houses are in the same high-risk flooding zone, not too far from each other. So if we got a big storm, which one do you think would survive? An especially vulnerable group are single-parent homes, because you have one person who's doing the economic responsibility and home caring instead of 2 people. And a gender report for the country showed that 40% of our homes, nearly half, are run by women, and that women, on average, have lower paying jobs and have a harder time accessing credit than men. And so single-parent homes are run by women are an especially vulnerable group. Now, altogether, these factors show how climate change is like a magnifying glass on the social and environmental problems that we're already facing. 4% of the population lives on less than $1,000 US a year. That's below the poverty line. And a vulnerability report showed that an additional 10% of the population, 1 in 10 people you know, could fall below the poverty line because of a disaster, whether that's a hurricane or a slow onset event, like what's affecting Julian's problem. That's why we need climate innovation. So what is it? Well, when you hear about climate change in islands, you often hear about adaptation. And adaptation is a slow process of adjustment, like what my family did when we had limited water supply. We changed our behaviors. Climate innovation includes adaptation, but it solves our problems in leaps and bounds by creating new opportunities for growth, while at its core solving these problems. I'm going to give you 3 examples of climate innovation happening in Antigua and Barbuda right now. The first is a finance example. $450,000 US isn't enough to achieve transformational change, but that's what the Environment Division gets from the Consolidated Fund each year to do its work, which is why the Environment Division has set up a national environmental fund called the SURF Fund. Not SURF, but Sustainable Island Resource Framework Fund. So where does this money come from? It comes from investments in renewable energy, like solar and wind power, which will cut carbon emissions and help us reduce the high cost of electricity. Money will also come from pollution charges, which is an incentive for people not to pollute, and from the international community, which is getting together finances to help us address climate change. So where does this money go to? Well, we're environmentalists, so we'll plant some trees. But a key outflow of this fund is to support adaptation, which means that vulnerable homes and even small businesses will get access to very low interest loans so that they can take the preventative measures that they need, like hurricane shutters or rainwater harvesting equipment, or strengthening the foundations of their home. The next is a policy example, the Environmental Protection and Management Bill. After 12 long years and an advocacy and social media campaign, we finally have comprehensive environmental legislation. And this legislation, the Environment Act, we're still waiting for it to be gazetted, but it's going to mainstream climate adaptation, make it more of an operating norm across sectors. So altogether, the finance and the policy help us set up a framework for long-term sustainable growth. So how do we address the needs on the ground right now? Let me introduce you to my friend, Rosita. She lives out in Freetown Village on the East Coast. And she's not waiting around to see how bad drought is going to get in this area. She's mobilizing the community to restore an old catchment, like the one that my grandparents built their house on. And so she wants to turn this into a community demonstration project, not for her personal use, but for the village. She's going to do an agricultural demonstration next to it, get school kids involved so that they get excited about watching eggplants grow and picking fruit from the tree. And she wants to revive the history of Freetown, which was one of the first villages where freed slaves settled after emancipation. So when I asked Rosita where she gets all of this energy from, because she's by far the most energetic woman in her 60s that I know, she told me a story of how, as a little girl, she lined up at that catchment with a bucket to collect water, her and the other villagers, during times of drought. So innovation isn't only about the new. It's also about the old knowledge and old experiences that we have. Like when people on strike turned to Witty Witty, transformed it into a pot of food to get through imposed starvation, and change the development trajectory of the country. People today are already suffering from the impacts of poor land management practices. And these problems will only get worse unless we do something about it. That's what our island climate innovators are doing. So tell me, where do you fit in? Thank you.